Pnawn da, good afternoon. Croeso i'n seminar rhwydwaith tystiolaeth gydweithredol, seminar 2, Dysgwyr agored I niwed eu teuluoedd. Welcome to our Collaborative Evidence Network seminar called SEN. This is seminar 2, Vulnerable Learners and Their Families. I'm Rich Bock. I'm the Research and Evaluation Lead for the North Wales Regional School Improvement Service, SGWIR. I also co-direct the work of the Collaborative Institute for Education and Research, Evidence and Impact, called KIRI, at the School of Educational Sciences at Bangor University. I also work with our university partners and with Welsh Government on a range of evidence interaction projects with schools in Wales. I think it's useful to briefly recap on the rationale for the seminar series and where it sits within the wider evidence interaction work in Welsh education. In 2021, Welsh Government published a national strategy for education, research and inquiry called ENSA as a framework designed to foster a more evidence-informed education system. This nascent model of collaborative school improvement is already helping to foster more meaningful partnership working between policymakers, universities, school improvement consortia, and of course, schools. ENSA has 4 main objectives: to ensure an evidence-informed policy development, to develop research capacity and equality in the higher education system, develop an evidence-informed profession, and to contribute to and learn from international research and evidence. The Collaborative Evidence Networks were set up in 2021 to support these overarching ENSA aims, and in particular to generate and share evidence on the impact of the COVID pandemic on the Welsh education system, identify evidence gaps, and to promote collaborative evidence gathering in Wales to fill these gaps. Nearly all of the 18 SEN projects have involved collaborations between universities in Wales and/or collaborations with key stakeholders to evaluate the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on various aspects of the education system, and in particular groups of learners. They also looked at ways to mitigate those impacts, as well as ways practitioners and learners can be better supported in the future. This is the second seminar of the series, and today we'll be hearing from 3 of the projects reporting on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the theme of vulnerable learners and their families. First, we'll hear from Dr. Steve Noon in Bangor University, who will present findings of an investigation on the impact of the pandemic on children, teachers and parents' health and well-being in ALN contexts. Second, Dr. Sonia Woodward and Dr. Fliss Cuffin, also Bangor University, will explain their work investigating the impact of the pandemic on refugee families and children in Wales. And finally, Professor Janet Goodall from Swansea University will share her group's work looking into parents, the pandemic, and transition in schools. After each presentation, we'll have a short Q&A session where the presenter can respond to the comments you put in the chat. And at the end of the seminar, all the presenters will join me for a general discussion about their work, plus the wider implications for the Welsh education system. So before I hand over to the first presenter, just a few practical aspects to explain. First, we have simultaneous translation facility available today, and you can choose your preferred language by selecting one of the language options at the top of your page. And second, you can post questions or comments to us in English or Welsh using the Slido chat function box you have on your interface. So please take the opportunity to post your questions or thoughts to us so we can use those in the Q&A sessions. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Steve Noon for our first presentation, which is called Investigating the Impact of the Pandemic on Children, Teachers and Parents' Health and Wellbeing in ALN Contexts. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Richard. Well, welcome, everybody. Delightful. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my research and research of my colleagues. Just draw attention really to our research group. There's a research group from Bangor. We all have an interest in an area of psychology which can roughly come under the title of contextual behavioral science. And if we were trying to sum that up, it's how can we create more nurturing environments? How do we remove the toxins that interfere with people achieving a good quality of life? And one of the great toxins is stress. It's a collaboration between Bangor University and our colleague Nick Hooper in Cardiff. And this was a great chance for us to work together. Next, please. So what I want to do is to give some context to enable us to really understand what we were doing and what we found. To do that in our literature review, I just want to draw attention to a really important part of our focus. We are interested in ALN, in helping children with additional learning needs, but it's a particular group, a subgroup It's those children who attend special schools. And the names we use have changed over time, currently in children with intellectual disabilities or children with learning disabilities. Certainly children with autism would come into this group. It's those children who struggle to develop functional skills, ability to communicate, and who are highly dependent on others in order for them to have an ordinary quality of life. And what you find in the literature, and it's been quite stark, is that there is this great vulnerability, that this group are more vulnerable to developing behaviors that challenge, and that then creates more stressful environments in which they live. They're also more likely to develop mental health problems. We know that the pandemic generally has been a challenge for the broader group of children with ALN, just in the demands of following education online and the whole issue of remote learning. And there have started to appear studies that have demonstrated the impact of lockdown on this group. So the negative impact on family carers and the group of teachers in special schools who seem to be experiencing higher levels of stress. Next, please. But I thought it'd be useful just to touch base with the core models that we use to explain stress and burnout. Now, the old Lazarus and Folkman model hasn't really lost its potency. The idea of this, it's called a transactional model of stress, is that two people can be faced with the same stressor, and yet only one of them experiences the destructive factors of stress. It seems a key component is how people appraise the challenge of the situation and the resources that's available to them. Likewise, burnout. Muriel Mashlak has identified, she refers it to the toxic three. If you are not able to achieve a sense of accomplishment in what you're doing, if you are experiencing a sense of emotional exhaustion, and the third category, the sense of feeling alienated or thinking in a cynical way about events, that is a toxic mix. Now, contextual behavioral sciences approaches this with the idea of psychological flexibility equals well-being, and psychological inflexibility equals struggle and psychological distress. Psychological flexibility is best understood as your capacity to encounter distressful emotional experiences without choosing to try and avoid them, not turning to drink or shutting down, but being willing to experience what you're experiencing, even when it's uncomfortable. And you're only going to do that if you're clear about what you want your life to stand for, what your values are, and being able to spend time investing in those values. And then the third component of psychological flexibility is being able to step back and disentangle from unhelpful negative thinking, negative judgments. Now, if you just keep hold of these ideas, it'll be useful when we come to look at some of our data. There is a growing literature in an area called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a therapeutic approach that uses these principles. There are now over 1,000 RCTs since 1983, which demonstrates its effectiveness. We were instrumental in developing these approaches with care staff, but it's also been used in special schools. And we've got a colleague in Toronto who's done some wonderful innovative work. We're helping parents run parent groups using principles based on psychological flexibility. So next, please. So our research questions, the first one's very simple. How has the pandemic impacted on the well-being of family carers and teaching staff of children who attend special schools in Wales? And then the two others are a little bit more aspirational. Can we look at psychological flexibility to help understand the well-being of this group? And is it feasible for us to develop some sort of school-based intervention on these principles? So how did we do this? Next, please. Well, we did it two ways. We set up an online survey available from the March right through to the end of June of 2022. And then we also decided to do qualitative measures and recruit parents and staff into focus groups, 2 separate focus groups. We originally wanted 4 schools, which would have ended up with 8 focus groups. But unfortunately, we were only able to recruit 1 school. Next slide, please. So here's our range of participants. We were able to we contacted all 40 special schools in Wales, and we received a positive response from half of them. So we had 20 schools. The head teacher identified a staff member who then we used to liaise, so to give access to an online survey. As you can see, there's a strong bias towards responsiveness from schools in the north of the country. And I suspect that is indicative of a key feature of how we go about recruiting. It helps to have a relationship, because what we were requesting was demanding on schools at a time when they were stretched. We can see our range of age groups in our participants. And in all, we were able, I think we got 94 participants from across Wales, and we ended up with 92 good sets of data. Next, please. So our online survey was made up of this. We had general demographics. We had a general question, did the pandemic impact your health and well-being? And there was just a 3-point Likert scale, not at all, a little bit, a lot. There were 2 open-ended questions. Tell us about how pandemic has impacted on you in your own words, and also in your own words, tell us how you're coping. And then we used 3 standard questionnaires, one on well-being, one on a standard measure for early signs of mental health problems, and one process measure on people's ability to accept and to tolerate and to accommodate difficult emotions. Next, please. Can everybody hear me? Somebody just said anyway, I'll carry on. So I want you to look at I want you to look at each of these questionnaires. So this is the WIMWebs, and this is a standard measure of well-being. Because if we look at these questions, there are 14 questions, you've got 7 here. I've been feeling optimistic, I've been feeling relaxed, I've been thinking clearly. What is it like if you're scoring none of the time for all these questions? What we really want is people to be scoring often or all of the time. Next, please. Our core 10 is a measure which is often used as a baseline in mental health therapy. And it's a more hard-hitting set of questions. I have felt tense, anxious, or nervous. I have felt panic or terror. I have made plans to end my life. Now, here, what's it like if you're scoring most or all of the time? What we want here is people really only occasionally and not all. Next slide, please. And then our acceptance and action questionnaire. I'm afraid of my feelings. You've got a 7-point scale. What's it like if you're recording almost always true? I worry about not being able to control my worries and feelings. Emotions cause problems in my life. So these are 3 useful measures that appear in the literature that we thought would be helpful in giving us an indication of how folk have coped as a consequence of the pandemic. Next, please. So the results. The first question, the impact of lockdown, we found that 90% indicated that COVID had a negative impact. In the 2 open-ended questions, we were able to do a thematic analysis on people's answers, and we found over 60% respondents reported a decrease in the overall enjoyment of life, and nearly half said that they had felt stressed or anxious. Next, please. Now, we look at the the two open-ended questions. So the first one, how has the pandemic impacted on your psychological health? As I've said, nearly half were experiencing stress and worry. A third were showing low mood. We ended up with 5 categories. Some people had financial worries, some people problems with missing family and friends. And then there was this sort of catch-all for other. Next, please. Here's an example of what somebody said. If you notice what we have here, that people, this was a teacher, juggling work demands was tricky, helping my child with their home education, little or no time for myself, tension with my partner, comfort was sought through alcohol and food. That is indicative of an unhelpful coping strategy, which we could see as experientially avoidant. I'm struggling with these distressful emotions. Next, please. But it's not all negative, because people were demonstrating that they were coping. And a major issue is that people were showing that they were making connections. Nearly half, the importance of connection and support. A third, also the importance of exercise. And then some people were identifying just good self-care habits. And let's have a quote. And next, please. So physical activities, communication via social media, which really took off. People were using their natural support systems. Networks are really important as we think how we go forward in supporting this vulnerable group who are vulnerable whether there's a pandemic or not. Next, please. So a few more examples of the qualitative responses to those two open-ended questions. Speaking to colleagues, going through similar work-life struggles, being able to connect with family and friends. And there's a lovely one at the bottom from one of the parents. Other parents and fantastic support from my youngest special school throughout the whole time. Of course, if you're one of the people who were recording low mood and were recording high scores on on the core 10, your motivation to connect with folk may have been compromised. Next, please. So our scores from our standard questionnaires from the WIMWebs, the core 10 and AAQ2. Well, what do these mean? If you click to the next, please. So we know that in the WIMWebs, you have a possible score of between 14 and 70, 14 questions. Joe Public, who's finding life fairly happy, is going to score around 50. So I think it's significant that we're finding lower scores here in the 40s. I'm reminded of a researcher who was at Bangor, Gordon Grant, and one of his videos he made of a family is talking about the stress that they experienced. And as much as she loved her child, she said the sparkly bits had gone out of her life. And that's what came to mind when I saw this data. Next, please. Now, the core 10, it goes from 0 to 40. What we want, healthy people, is to be scoring low down, not at all. I'm not experiencing any of these thoughts. Our group was scoring 13, 14. And that then places the mild range of mental health problems, where we're touching base with depression and anxiety. And next, please, for the AAQ2. Again, these scores for the AAQ2, the higher the score, the greater the psychological flexibility. So what we don't want are low scores here. We want high scores in the WIMWebs and low scores in the core 10 and the AAQ2. And the correlations we find is the more psychologically flexible you are, the less you score on the core 10 and the more you score on the WIMWebs. So we did demonstrate psychological flexibility seems to be a useful measure for identifying a perspective, a skill set, an orientation that is useful to know about and to cultivate to help people deal with the stresses that they're faced with. Next, please. So in our focus group, as I said, we were only able in the end to work with one school, and our recruitment there, we ended up with 4 parents and 8 teachers. Now, if we move on to the next slide, when we did our thematic analysis, we had a semi-structured interview, so that did sort of curve people's discussion. But certainly with the parents, we just had to follow their discussion because they had a lot to say. But these headings, these themes are worth just calling out, really. That exacerbation of existing difficulties in parents. We had some sub-themes, which I'll look at in a second. There were creation of new problems, clear indications of psychological distress that people were experiencing, but at the same time, evidence of positive coping mechanisms, and people did have a few ideas for going forward. In the staff group, there was something similar. What we found with the staff group is, although it was similar, they were less extreme. So yet there were problems with psychological adjustment and what we refer to as altered states. Clearly, there were additional burdens, and there were examples of good practice, maintenance, what we call the maintenance and positive coping, and ideas for the future. And if we move on to the next slide, what I've tried to do here, I hope everybody can see this. This is to capture all the themes of both of the focus groups with their sub-themes. So the parents groups are in the circles in blue, and the staff groups are in the boxes in red. And around each of them are their sub-themes. And then I've grouped them under 4 headings. And I'm doing this to try and help us create a narrative from this data. So if we start on the left, the psychological impact of the pandemic. The parents, this theme of psychological distress, these sub-themes were made up disturbed behavior patterns. People found themselves behaving in odd ways, extreme ways, losing the rag, that sort of thing. I'll give some examples in a second, but because I'm short of time, I wanted to give the conceptual overview, and then we'll have a look at some of the examples. Parents demonstrate, we're talking about an increase in aversive sensations and thoughts, in that they were having panics, they were having a lot of intrusive negative thinking that came out in the discussions. And there was also the surprise at the impact of the psychological responses. The school staff felt disconnected. Old difficulties seemed to be exacerbated. There were change. The people talked about being in a fog, this lack of mood, lack of motivation, a lot of worry. And then we look at the actual increased stresses. So there's a change in the psychological well-being. There seems to be indications of this. And then there is this increase in stresses at this period of time. So for the parents, there was a greater demand in terms of care practice. There was clearly a deterioration in available support of services, and they were experiencing fatigue. What we've done here with these 2 main themes is, because they were very close, I've kind of linked them, exacerbating existing difficulties and creating new problems. But they felt disconnected from previous support. All talked about an impact on their child's behavior. Some of them were behaving in more challenging ways. Some of them became more introverted. 1 or 2 stopped talking. There were additional housework challenges because the children were around the house more, and the challenge of home tuition. School were adjusting to the forced changes and the extra workload, inconsistencies of new staff coming in and not knowing the routines, and the challenging behavior of their students who were struggling with the changes that were going on. So these were the negative things, but the positive coping, both groups identify actually caring and interaction with the child as a major supportive factor. That's really important, and that's been found in the literature. There were reduced pressures for some of the parents, because actually when they had an appointment, there was no problem, there's no traffic on the road, and there's no waiting. They relied on their humor and having goals. For the staff group, again, their interaction with the pupils, having things that nourish them, their hobbies that nourish them, being able to change their focus and focus on things of greater interest, and their family, their networks. Their ideas for the future, they're genius. One is, it was said that we need to invest and enhance our supportive networks. And some of the school that I was working with were very creative in creating informal networks that some of the parents used, not all. And then the other parents were asking for some specific psychological supports. Whereas the staff were saying, whatever happened, we need to understand this. And they would do with some help, some guidelines, some information about to explain what went on that made me feel like I did and act like I did. So in the last few minutes, I want to give you some meat on the bone, really, of actual phrases and examples from these core themes. Next, please. So from one of the parents, this is exacerbating existing difficulties. And this was a mum who had 2 children, both had Down syndrome and autism. And they, as a consequence of lockdown, they were fighting more and their relationship had deteriorated. And so she's saying, these are pseudonyms. Mary and Holly no longer get on as a result of lockdown there, but they're getting there. We were working bloody hard to get there, but it's been awful. Next, please. In terms of creation of new problems, another parent, that their child had stopped talking and had become quiet, and she doesn't talk at school anymore, so she's got this social anxiety. Another parent, my lovely little girl's back, but the damage is done, isn't it? So we've got work to do really hard to rebuilding sibling relationship. That's the twins. And another parent, she prefers to be home. She didn't want to go out. I suppose it's hard, had a major effect on her. So well, because wherever I go, she comes with me, doesn't she? Next slide. I'll just quickly, if you give me one more minute, psychological distress. The surprise. This is one of the surprise that one of the parents expressed, and I think it's hugely powerful. This because I felt I couldn't cope anymore. I used to think I can do this. These are a group of copers. I can crack on because I'm like, get on with everything. I can do anything. I'm Superwoman. Okay, we're going to have to go right towards the end, so if you can next slide, please. And again, and again. Just give you an indication of the parent of the staff focus group. Adjustments, altered states. I'm honest with you, I think I've been in a funk for the last 2 years. Now I've run out of time, so I just want to come to my 5 slides. So could you move me right to the end, please? Next slide, please. Recommendations, picking up on people's suggestions. What we're trying to do is to develop, co-produce an accessible and highly interactive e-learning that helps explain how we go from thriving. Where does burnout come from? What is it? Why work when I interact with people? Help people to understand, to clarify their values. Help them to understand that when they're stressed, their mind runs away and they can think very negatively. And what can they do to disentangle themselves from their thoughts? To get better at naming the psychological distress and emotional states that turn up. Really, how can we create e-learning that promotes greater psychological flexibility? And we've been able to develop a prototype that we're working on at the moment. But our hope now is to work with school staff and with the school, that unity, to have a shared understanding of some fundamental psychological processes. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That's really, really fascinating. So I've got a few comments and thoughts here, but just before we start, you were dropping out of the connection at the end there, so I hope people caught the last sort of 5 minutes of your presentation. So we'll persist with the dialogue now. If the connection goes, we might have to skip the Q&A with Steve and go to the next presenters, Sonia and Fliss, but we'll give it a go, Steve, for 5 minutes and hope your connection holds up. I feel like one of those Radio 4 guys who says we've lost the person into the line. So here we go. So Steve, what do you think the implications are for schools and policy following your work in terms of practical things?
So you're asking me what practical things schools can do?
Yes.
Oh, I've lost you. Well, one really important thing is we have to normalize the psychological response. And
I think we're losing Steve, so I'm wondering whether it's prudent to go to the next present and hope Steve's feed stabilizes in a few minutes.
Let's move on. Okay.
Okay, yeah. Well, we'll put you on hold, Steve. Sorry to cut you off. We'll give you a chance to sort of answer the questions in the general Q&A from 5:35. So next we'll move to our second presenters. That's Dr. Sonia Woodward and Dr. Fliss Cuffin, both of Bangor University. And they're going to talk to us about their project, which was called Investigating the Impact of the Pandemic on Refugee Families and Children in Wales. Over to you, Sonia and Fliss.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard, and thank you, Steve, as well. So Pnawn da and good afternoon to everyone. We are very pleased to have this opportunity to present our research that investigates the impact of the pandemic on refugee children and young people in schools in Wales. Next slide, please. Next, that one, yes. So this is a collaboration between myself and Sonia at Bangor University and our colleagues at Cardiff Met University. It's been great working with them and being able to share our expertise and learn new things together. Next slide, please. So here are our research aims and objectives. So our plan was to collate, analyse the experiences of just a small sample of practitioners who were already working with refugee learners in schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason that we chose to have a small sample of practitioners was partly due to the limited time we had to collect data, and also for us to be able to have some quite long and involved contributions from those people who we were interviewing. We wanted to get a better understanding of what was happening in schools, of the training, the resources and those external agencies that were needed that would help to support the well-being of refugee learners, not just during the pandemic, but also in coming out of the pandemic as well. We wanted to help to develop classroom and whole school strategies. So we were looking for good practice in schools and things that are working already in order to be able to support teaching and learning across Wales. And then, of course, to be able to share this evidence with the Welsh Government, with leaders in schools, teachers and support staff, everybody who, is working with this vulnerable group of learners, with the aim of building on policy and improving practice in schools where it's needed. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a look at the background literature. And I think it's worth saying that the data collection at this point happened before the war in Ukraine. So some of the things that we're hearing in the news at the moment about the experiences of Ukrainian refugees seem in some ways quite dissimilar to the experiences that we were reading about in the literature review. So the literature that we were looking at suggests that refugees and asylum seekers do face a wide range of challenges. And in terms of education, one of the most relevant is that they've often missed months or even years of education during their flight and during that migratory journey. It's not uncommon for families to have been in refugee camps for up to 10 years. And obviously educational schooling opportunities there would either be very poor quality or intermittent or not happen at all. So that means that there obviously a majority of refugees have missed some of the fundamentals of literacy and numeracy, and they need to catch up once they come to the UK and start education in the UK. Obviously, schools need to assist with this catching up, and that's what we were seeing in the literature. And although there's many examples of where this is happening, the most recent evidence shows that many refugee learners are still falling significantly behind their non-migrant peers when we get to sort of GCSE level, for example. Next slide, please. One of the things that the literature really focuses on, and we see this across different countries and in lots of different contexts, and this is something that's very important to us when we're thinking about the education of our children and young people in Wales, is that school is seen as a safe place. So for many refugees or asylum seekers who've not had that security and stability of education for long periods of time, the school is the safe and continuous place to be. Teachers are able to monitor their well-being, they're able to provide specialist support, and refugee learners are able to establish friendships and start to feel integrated and accepted into their new society. But nevertheless, often teachers are unsure about what type of support is most needed, and the needs of these learners sometimes are poorly understood. Often in the classroom, when it comes to providing additional support, they're lumped together with other EAL learners, or even with students who have additional learning difficulties. And that type of practice fails to address their unique circumstances. Next slide, please. So just to give you some context around the numbers and distribution of refugee learners in the UK and in Wales, it's actually really difficult to calculate those total figures. It's a very fluid situation, and numbers are changing all the time. But what we do know is that there has been a dramatic increase over recent years, and that is making planning for services much more difficult. So in response to different global situations, these are some of the things that have happened. We've got starting back sort of 8 or 9 years ago, we've had the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, where we've had over 23,000 refugees from Syria come to the UK, and the number you can see in brackets there is the approximate number of Syrian refugees in Wales from that resettlement scheme. Then in 2021, the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme took in over 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan, with 15,000 urgently deported during the Taliban takeover and deported into the UK, of which around 250 have come into Wales. In 2022, so more recently, and say after we collected the data, but I think still very significant now, because we need to look at these numbers, how they're changing, because they're going to have more of an impact on schools than ever, and the need for us to have that educational settings right for this group of learners. Wales became a super sponsor for 1,000 Ukrainian refugees, but actually those numbers now are closer to, or even slightly over, 3,000 Ukrainian refugees in Wales. So over that period of the pandemic, during lockdown, there were around 3,000 asylum seekers across Wales, and they're concentrated mostly in the cities. Now, as what's happened now is that there are still many more refugees who are waiting to come in. They're waiting for visas and they're waiting for resettlement. And the places where we're settling refugees across Wales, it's no longer just about being concentrated in the cities. It's having an impact on rural communities and educational settings as well. The next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit about our methodology, about how we went around structuring and collecting data. We very much, our strategy was to look for information-rich sites, and between our team in Cardiff, who were familiar with the schools already where there were refugee learners, and in the north where Sonia's been very involved with families who've got children in schools in our local area, we managed to identify 9 institutions altogether, from primary through to further education, 6 in the south, 3 in the north, and we interviewed 12 participants altogether. Quite long interviews, asking them very sort of open-ended questions, sort of semi-structured interview style, about what had happened for them during the pandemic and about where they were going next with their provision. So you can see there's a range of different people that we interviewed, from head teachers, class teachers, EAL specialists, bilingual teaching assistants, who all had a wealth of knowledge. We conducted the interviews online and in person between January and March 2022. And with that data, we undertook a thematic analysis, and that was checked by multiple investigators through both collaborations as well. So the aim really, although we had a small participant group, was to give a kind of snapshot of what was happening in schools at the time, but to give as an authentic snapshot as possible, with the aim being that this is something that we can build on as the situation changes, and we, thoughts of further collaboration with the same team to move this area of research forward. So now I'm going to hand over to Sonia, who will take you through the results of the study and also the recommendations.
Thank you, Fliss. So these are our key findings, and these very much reflect what participants wanted to share with us. So I'll just go through each of these in turn quite succinctly. So next slide, please. So one of the things that participants kept on repeating was that most, if not all, of the refugee learners in the schools had missed large chunks of their education. In some cases, some refugees have had almost no education, and the real fundamentals of literacy and numeracy are missing. And in addition to this, in order to get refugee status, the UN criteria does state that refugee families will be given refugee status if they have additional physical or psychological needs. So, by definition, the ones that are coming in have got these additional needs, often additional learning needs. And also, quite a lot of our interviewees spoke about the, the trauma that these learners had experienced, often unidentified trauma. So most, if not all of them, will have experienced losses. They've lost their homes, their families. They've suffered quite a lot of upheaval and displacement during their journeys. They've often endured violence, discrimination, uncertainty, and fear. And participants spoke about how it's going to take years for these refugee children to really be able to express this trauma and, begin to deal with the consequences. So this means that schools, as well as needing to assist refugee learners to catch up academically and provide, additional academic skills development, they also have a key role in helping learners to overcome their trauma. And obviously the participants, the teachers, the head teachers were very aware of this. And this is, very much on their radar. Next slide, please. So following on from this, teachers also spoke about the inequalities that this group of learners often are experiencing. And so although not all refugee households are experiencing economic disadvantage, a lot of them are struggling with issues such as inadequate housing, overcrowding, lack of heating, poverty, food insecurity, etc., unemployment. And many of them are living in cramped conditions with limited resources, lacking even a quiet, warm space in which to work at home. Now, of course, we know that some of these disadvantages are shared with other groups, but teachers were very concerned, and they said that at the start of the pandemic, they'd been very concerned that school closures would exacerbate these existing social and educational inequalities, because we know that homeschooling is largely dependent on the learning opportunities and resources provided in the home environment. And some families have got quite low literacy in their home languages, so that they weren't able to support their children with the work that was being sent home. Next slide, please. And this is something that schools find very difficult, communication with families. And it's one of the biggest challenges that the schools and teachers have to deal with. And of course, this was pronounced during COVID, because they had to send messages home about social distancing and stay at home measures, etc. And this sort of government advice and instructions had to be communicated in ways that families could understand. So this lack of a common language means that schools and teachers have got very limited information about the backgrounds of this group of learners, even things like how much education they've missed or what their additional health needs are. So they have to make do wherever they can on whatever the resources are, and it can sometimes be bilingual teaching assistants. It might be other children in the school or friends or members of staff who can speak the language. The professional translation service is not always available. And one contributor spoke to me about saying they do use a translation service, but they're often going through, using other children in the school and asking them to liaise with families who are having to disclose sometimes quite confidential or sensitive information about their migratory journey. And it's not really very appropriate to have to rely on this. So this communication barrier is very significant. And it means that it's very difficult for these families to find out about the education system in the UK. It also means it's very hard for their voices to be heard, and also for them to make use of services which do exist, for example, mental health services or counselling services, which are only really available in Welsh or English. Next slide, please. However, there were some positives, and we heard several stories from teachers who said that actually during COVID there were increased communication links with families, because schools had weekly check-ins with families, and that helped to build good relationships with refugee families as well. And so that was a real plus, and perhaps is something that they can continue to work on. Also, the refugee learners were classed as a vulnerable group, and so they were invited into school every day, and many of them took this opportunity, and they were able to benefit from small classes and intensive support, and this enabled them to catch up on some of their missed education. And this really demonstrates one of the biggest strengths of this group, their commitment to education, as well as obviously the commitment of their teachers. And so without the mainstream kids on campus, this group of vulnerable learners were able to get intensive one-to-one language support, help with using computers, and also well-being activities in the afternoon, such as gardening and cooking and sports. And several of the teachers said this was better than normal provision for this group of learners, and it allowed some of them to make good progress. Next slide, please. However, they weren't all positives, and not all vulnerable learners did come into school every day, especially during the first lockdown. Some parents were quite nervous about sending their children into school. So for these, their language skills deteriorated while they were at home. They were not hearing or speaking English for many months. And also their social skills were affected. This is a group with few social contacts. Some of them even arrived during the pandemic. So they don't really have lots of people that they know locally who are going to be getting in touch with them saying, do you want to come for a socially distanced walk? And so there was a loss of confidence and, a loss of social skills. And the teachers talked about a noticeable relief when they returned to school, but also a noticeable deterioration in their basic skills. Next slide, please. And some of the other obstacles which, existed prior to COVID and, continue to exist is that in this group, some of the, if not all of the parents are very keen to capitalize on this opportunity for their children to have an education. This is like there's sort of one chance to make good. But because the parents themselves don't really speak any English, when their children start to learn English, just to be able to speak, even conversationally, they can easily overestimate their children's abilities and underestimate the obstacles to success. So they start to think, oh, great, he's speaking English now. He'll be able to go to university. He'll be a professional and, he'll be able to sort everything out for the whole family. And these parents don't really understand the system. They don't understand how difficult it is to get 5 grade C's at GCSE, how difficult it is to do A-levels through the medium of English, or, what alternatives there are to going to university. And several of the participants spoke about having to have quite frank and often quite painful discussions with parents and learners and having to say to them, there really is no possibility of this child doing A-levels and going on to university. Next slide, please. And this sort of carries on that theme that one of the ongoing problems is that this group of learners are often put in the mainstream timetable too early. They might have some intensive ESOL to begin with, 4 or 5 hours a week to begin with, but this drops away. And after that, or even, whilst that's going on, they're in the main timetable. So I heard stories of people saying, there'd been children that had been, or girls or boys, sitting at the back of classes for years, not really speaking any English still, not really understanding what was going on in these chemistry and biology and geography lessons. So the GCSE subject terminology is, a particular challenge for them. And this is, it can be very disheartening because it means that however hard they work at their English, they still need quite a lot of time to get up to the standard of GCSE. And in some schools, there really isn't very much ESOL support. It's just a few hours a week to begin with, and most of the time they're just in the main timetable. There are also schools where they've got, bigger numbers of refugees, and they've got a completely different provision where they mostly focus, at least for 3 months and often for 6 months, on ESOL and EAL, a little bit of maths and IT, and they don't put these learners into the main timetable. However, this is one of the ongoing problems, and if we just go to the next slide, I can talk through this in my recommendations. So one, really this is in order of importance. So it's really important that schools have, where possible, bilingual teaching assistants. These have got a very important role to play. They help to settle refugee learners. They can encourage use of home languages and help to liaise with families and help to give the families their voice. Make sure the voices of refugees are heard wherever possible. And also, if it is possible, we need the early identification of additional needs. At least we need to know about their backgrounds and how much schooling has been missed. And then following on from the previous slide, I suggest that, and in fact, teachers have suggested this, it's come from them, that they need an intensive period of mainly ESOL provision before learners have to join the main timetable. And of course, this has to be flexible. Some, very academically able children might be able to rejoin, sooner than others, etc. Some might be able to go back and do a few subjects, but still mostly ESOL and maths. So there can be some flexibility. And this sort of flexible timetable, which will allow this group of learners the time that they need to get the language skills, to perhaps just do a few GCSEs and succeed in those, rather than be put on the whole mainstream timetable doing 8 subjects, most of which they're going to really struggle with. Clearly, it's important to have better communication links with families and improved access to translation services, more training for staff in signs of trauma and distress, and perhaps, ways of dealing with this. And of course, having language services available in home languages for all refugee learners is going to be probably impossible, but there perhaps has to be some move in this direction, and an increased emphasis on well-being and pastoral support. So that is our findings. Those are our findings. And I think that's all I need to say about that. And perhaps we can move on to the questions.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Fliss. That's fascinating. We've got some 8 minutes before we got the next session. So I've got a question about you mentioned good practice in some of these learners arriving in schools. Afforded the opportunity to have focused catch-up provision. I wondered, in the course of your work, did you find examples of schools who were using, what am I interested in, any evidence-informed, evidence-based ESOL programs, strategies or approaches that were particularly useful?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. So there was one school where we interviewed, and they had prior to, I think it was March when we did the interview, 76 refugees, had just a sort of great big influx of refugees had come in the November. And I think they said it was because they were the only school that wasn't oversubscribed. So it was, in the Cardiff area. So they were suddenly, overwhelmed. And this is the same school where they said they had previously had some learners just sitting in the backs of classes for years, not really having enough English to engage with the lesson, to ask questions, to really understand the vocabulary. And so they set up, or have set up, a completely new provision or a new timetable, which is essentially about 15 hours of ESOL and English a week, with some maths, perhaps 5 hours of maths, and some IT, and perhaps, I think there was one other subject, perhaps PE. So it's predominantly English language, so that they can, whatever their level, whatever their academic and literacy background, they can just really focus on getting fluent, or getting them at least, to start to be fluent in English before they go into the mainstream classes. And then after 12 weeks, they assess how they're getting on. They said quite a lot of them stay, well, all of them stay for at least 3 months in that. And then some will move into perhaps 1 or 2 mainstream classes. They can stay for 6 months, and again, they're assessed. And then if they still don't think they are ready to go back to the mainstream timetable, that will trigger some sort of investigation of, SEN investigation, to see if there are perhaps additional learning needs, which might be, an explanation for why they haven't managed to get to their, to the right level of fluency. So children can stay in this provision for up to a year. And then even when they go back in, they have continued language support in whatever it is, chemistry, geography, but they also are put on a reduced timetable. So they're not suddenly in 8 different lessons. They can be in, perhaps a few of the subjects and still doing quite a bit of English and math. So I think that can perhaps, I can see how that perhaps has to depend a bit on having quite large numbers of refugee learners. If you've only got 10 in the whole school, you probably can't set up a completely different timetable like that. But where you can, and where you've got a team of ESOL teachers, then that seems to me to be very good practice.
We've got a related question in the chat, listen, Sonia, on the issue of growing language skills on arrival. Someone asked, have you thought about it? Did the respondents talk about comparisons with the Welsh language immersion models in schools?
Yes. Shall I answer that, please? Somebody said, one of the teachers actually said that when learners come to Wales, they can be, and they are offered, I think it's at a particular age, perhaps with very young children, they don't offer them this, but perhaps with the slightly older primary children, they can do a 3-month immersion in Welsh. And that same service is not offered in English. So there's an inconsistency there. And one of the teachers did point that out and say this is really what they would really benefit from. Some of the refugee learners would really benefit. And they have in North Wales, I mean, we've got examples of refugee learners who've gone off to the Welsh Immersion Centre and they've come back speaking, really well. And they, even the best Welsh speakers in their class. And so this is not to say, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that all these refugee learners are having lots of difficulties and they can't ever really, get to the base, even to the basis of being able to do GCSEs because of their language difficulties, because quite a few are very successful and they successfully learn Welsh, English, and of course they're speaking Arabic or whatever it is at home. So yes, that's a very good idea.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last interesting question. Someone's put, they concur with the recommendations, but they see implications for capacity issues in the system. So things such as certification of ALN takes a significant amount of time and resource. And with budgets already stretched, can you see a way this system can overcome this?
Well, I mean, I think it's very difficult because unless we've got people who are able to assess these learners, obviously using their own languages in Arabic or in Farsi or whatever other language these refugees are speaking. I mean, it's, we're talking about complex additional needs, which I've gone through, missed education, trauma, and then perhaps other rather perhaps more common learning difficulties. So in order to identify and assess for all of those issues, it's going to take, quite a lot of expertise. I think we can use teachers' expertise, the people that are working closely with these refugee learners obviously do develop quite a lot of skill in recognizing the signs of someone who's going to be able to flourish or thrive in the system and someone who's perhaps doesn't look like they're going to be able to cope. And so I think we can use, teachers as our starting point, but we probably also need to have other, we need translation services really as well.
Great. Thanks, Fliss. Thanks, Sonia. We'll leave it there. We've got a minute to go before our next presenter, Janet's coming on. So we're going to head on over to Professor Janet Goodall shortly from Swansea University. She's going to talk to us about her project with her colleagues called Parents, the Pandemic and Transition. And don't forget, as Janet's talking, please add your thoughts, comments or questions in the chat box. We can grab those during the session. We can ask them. I can read them out to the presenters during the question time at the end. So over to you, Janet, on your session.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. So this project was looking at parental engagement, parent engagement around children's learning, young people's learning. And I was joined by some very wonderful people, Dr. Patricia Diorolsi, Yi Zhang, and the Child Poverty Action Group and Children in Wales. And the Child Poverty Action Group, and Children in Wales were particularly helpful both in analysing data and bringing their particular expertise to that, but also in access to groups of people. So can we go to the next slide, please? A little bit of the background. I'm always worried about this because anybody who's heard me present on this before, and I rather feel that probably everybody has heard me say all this before, but I'm going to say it again because I still need to keep saying it. That parent engagement with learning, and I mean with learning, I don't mean parents coming into school, I don't mean parents rocking up to parents' evening, I mean parents talking to their children and young people at home. We know that it's an important lever toward narrowing the achievement gap. And there's a good deal of research that we know about the value and the impact of parental engagement. It doesn't exist in education unless it's got an acronym. So there's an acronym for you, PEWL, parental engagement with learning, or parent engagement with learning. Thing is, we know a lot less about how to successfully support that and how schools and school staff can successfully support that. And one of the issues is, of course, we all talk about schools, but what we mean are people in schools. You know, schools are, the school itself is the community when I'm talking about it, rather than the actual building. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the difference, I think, is important to get clear in the literature, that we can talk about parent involvement with school, and that's school focused. And it's about parents coming into the school. It's about parents, in the words of many teachers, singing from the same hymn sheet, supporting the school. It's focused around school, and it's often perceived as parents helping teachers or parents supporting teachers. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I am saying that the literature would say, and experience would say, that it's rather like Wikipedia. It's not a bad place to start, but it's a really bad place to end up. Because what makes a difference is parent engagement with learning. And that's around the learning that happens in the home, in the car, on the way, on the bus, whatever. And it's about parent interactions with young people, whether that's very young children and helping them learn to read, write, and figure, helping them learn to tie their shoes. And I have immense respect for anybody who can teach a 5-year-old to tie their shoes. Or if it's about a secondary parent talking to their young person about what's important and what's happening in the world. So that is the difference that I'd like you to keep in mind. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the research questions that we had were the 3 that were on the screen. How have relationships between parents and school staff in Wales changed over the period of lockdowns? Have relationships moved along that continuum? So have the relationships moved from being centered around the school to being centered around learning? That's the change that we're looking for. And what can we learn from the changes that will support parent engagement in young people's learning in Wales? So we can go to the next slide. And I thought it was important to highlight this. The literature is really, really clear. This is, when we're talking about a school community, both bottom up and top down. So bottom up in the sense that parents need to be involved and engaged, and top down in the fact that the leaders and the leadership of the school need to be involved. So there's a wonderful phrase that's used by Parents International, nothing for us without us. So that's what I mean by the bottom up and the parental engagement. But from the top down, the leaders need to be involved and they need to be on board with what we're doing. And they need to take an asset-based approach to working with families, rather than saying, oh, here are all the things that are wrong with our families, starting from here are all the things that we can build on with our families. And a model for other staff to have good, respectful relationships with parents. And it really is all about relationships and respect. I should say that when I say parent, I mean an adult with a significant caring responsibility for the child. So parent, carer, grandparent, whoever. I'm going to keep saying parent because it's shorter, but that's what I mean. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the data collection, and of course this was taking place during lockdown, was survey for parents, survey for staff, case studies of transitions and focus groups of parents. And I'm concentrating here on the work around parent engagement rather than the work around transition, because we're talking mainly about vulnerable families this afternoon, but I'm happy to answer some questions about transition as we go. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the survey for the school staff, we tried really, really hard. We wrote to everybody we could think of. We utilised every partnership we could think of with all the IT providers in Wales as well, but we still had a very low response rate for teachers. So that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about teachers' responses, that it is a very low response rate. However, there's still teachers' voices and they still are important to hear. Could we go to the next slide, please? We did much better in terms of parents survey. So we had over 200 parents responses, most of them concentrated in primary school, most of them from backgrounds who describe themselves as white. Interestingly, 27% were in receipt of free school meals and 49% in receipt of means tested benefits, which are both of those higher than the Wales national average. And I think, again, this is down to the help that we had from the Child Poverty Action Group and Children in Wales in motivating and helping us find some of the voices that often aren't heard in a lot of this research. If we go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we were really interested in was the value that parents and school staff place on parental engagement with young people's learning. The other thing that I think is important to realize and often gets lost in these things is that a great number of staff are actually parents themselves. So it's not a dichotomist group, but we were asking the staff to think about it with their teacher hat on rather than their parent hat on. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of people in both groups thought that parental engagement with children's learning was really important. More than half parents wanted to know more about how they could support learning, and 85% of teaching staff who answered, again a small sample, wanted to know more about parental engagement with learning and how to support it. And interestingly, even during lockdown, 80% of parents said they wanted to be more involved with their child's learning. And looking at the research that's beginning to come out now about what went on with parents in the home over lockdown, it's very, very interesting, some of the research that's coming out now. And this group of parents that were mainly reporting to us, so parents in facing challenging circumstances, seem to have spent more time working with their children than parents from the upper SES groups, at least in some of the research that's coming out now. Could we go to the next slide, please? Very interestingly, we asked families and school staff to define parental engagement with learning. This was an open question, so it was analysed using thematic analysis, using emergent themes. We didn't use a framework. We didn't impose a framework on the data. We used emergent themes and then used that engagement involvement framework to think about where those themes would sit. And most of the parents who reported talked about academic support. And again, there were preponderance of primary parents, so a lot of them spoke about reading at home. A lot of them spoke about assisting with homework. And again, this aligns with the literature in the field. When we ask parents how they support learning at home, often they say, oh, well, I watch their homework, I read to them, I listen to them read. When we asked staff, they talked about academic, but they also talked about personal development. They talked about behavior and parents supporting behavior. And they also talked about partnerships between schools and families working together. And again, possibly it was because it was the middle of an pandemic and we were all concerned about well-being. There was an emphasis on not just children's academic work, but also their social and emotional development. Can we go to the next slide, please? I found this really, really interesting. Fewer than half of the parents felt that they experienced barriers to their children's learning, although slightly more than half would like more support. But 85% of the staff, again, small sample, felt that parents experienced barriers to supporting their children's learning, and 95% of them felt parents needed more support. It's too small a sample to say much from that, but I found it really, really interesting that parents felt they experienced, fewer parents overall felt they experienced barriers to supporting learning than staff did. And that, again, is not particularly unusual. That split is not particularly unusual when you look at the wider literature in the field. But if we go to the next slide, please, we can look at some of the barriers. Now, when we asked parents and staff what kind of barriers get in the way, what stops you or hinders you from supporting your child's learning. Language was an issue. Lack of equipment, of course, we were talking about home learning, home learning in the home. Lack of time and lack of information. And again, this accords with the literature in the field. And we asked parents what they would like, what more support they would like. They wanted more information from the schools. What more can we be doing? How can we help more? More support from teachers. And particularly, and I know this has been found with other groups that have done research through the collaborative networks, more support with Welsh language. Because, of course, if you have a child in Welsh medium education and the parents don't speak Welsh at home, this presents a definite issue with supporting learning at home. When we asked staff, it was interesting that staff talked about a lack of confidence, a lack of knowledge on the part of parents, so a lack of parental self-efficacy, if you will. Parents didn't talk about a lack of confidence. Parents didn't feel that this was an issue. A lack of staff thought about a lack of time, a lack of digital access and literacy. And interestingly, staff talked about negative school experiences as being a barrier for parents engaging with learning. And again, if we look at the literature, that does seem to be an issue, but it's interesting that it didn't arise in the parent responses. The type of support that staff suggested that would be useful for parents, more information, obviously, access to schools, and digital support, and family workshops, which is interesting. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what about the changes in the relationship in the schools in Wales over the period of the 2 years? 44% of parents felt they had a better relationship with teachers, but 18% felt that they had a worse relationship with teachers. And it was interesting because, again, this doesn't necessarily accord with some of the other literature that's coming out, and it doesn't accord with some of the other research that we've done for Welsh Government. Is that because of the parent group that we had? I don't know. But it is interesting. But more parents felt that the late relationship had got better than felt that the relationship had got worse. But it's interesting to contrast that to the staff views, where, again, small sample, but 80% of the staff felt they had a better relationship with parents. So staff were more positive about the changes through the pandemic. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm looking at the things coming up in the chat, but I'm really not able to multitask to that extent, I'm afraid. So we also asked, were there changes in how parents engaged with learning over the period, both parents, how they engaged, and staff, how they engaged, how they thought parents engaged? 35% of parents felt more able to support children's learning, 30% less, so almost evenly spread there. 43% felt more engaged with their children's learning, 32% felt less engaged, so not as evenly spread, but it's interesting, there isn't a clear differentiation there. There isn't a clear one way or the other. But there is a clear difference between how many people felt engaged with their children's school, and unfortunately that's gone the wrong way. When we look at staff, 50% of staff felt parents were more able to support their children's learning, and 50% felt that parents were more engaged with their children's learning. But interestingly, and I think hopefully, 60% of staff felt they were better able to support parent learning. And one of the things that has come out in other research that we've done for Welsh Government and other research that's coming out is a greater understanding between parents with parents understanding more about the work that teachers do to support children emotionally and behaviorally, and staff understanding of the work that parents do to support learning. Could we go to the next slide, please? So we asked parents, since the COVID-19 lockdown, I feel I have a good relationship with my child's teachers. And as you can see, more people didn't have an opinion on that than anything else, but still 35 felt that the relationship had got better. And the next slide shows the staff view. We could go to the next slide, please. And again, staff again were more positive than parents. I have a good relationship with my students' parents. More people strongly agreed with that. So it's interesting that staff feel that the relationships are stronger and parents are less sure about the strength of those relationships. Can we go to the next slide, please? One of the things that is very, very clear in the general literature and also in the literature around parental engagement, parent engagement in Wales, is the need for training for staff. If we bring in a new scheme of work, we train staff. Yet we're asking staff to do something that we haven't trained them for. So we ask staff, is this still the case? So have you attended any professional development around supporting parental engagement? Obviously, the majority say no. If you could move on just a bit, please. Should be another slide that comes up. Yeah. The majority of them had very little or nothing about parent engagement in their teacher education. And again, we know this from previous work for Welsh Government, that either it's not mentioned or it's mentioned in terms of difficult conversations, or it's left to mentors. And the third slide, the third bit on that slide, and very strong view that staff would like to know more about how to support parental engagement in learning. So in many ways, we're pushing at an open door here. Staff, as you saw very early on, and by staff, I mean widely defined people involved in schooling, feel that parental engagement is important and feel that they would like to know more about how to support it. So in some ways, we're pushing in an open door, although I do take the point that was made earlier about the time in schools. So any training that we offer to teachers or to school staff has got to be appropriate, and it's got to be clear, and it's got to be time sensitive. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So to answer the research questions, have relationships between parents and schools in Wales changed over the period? Staff feel more able to support learning. Parents overall don't see a negative change in relationships. They don't necessarily see a strong positive change, but they don't see a negative change. But staff do feel that things have improved. Have relationships moved along the continuum from involvement to engagement? Somewhat, yes, but not enough. We still have more to do to support our learners. What can we learn from the changes to support improved parental engagement in young people's learning? Well, we still have a need for more training for staff and more support for parents, both of which are being asked for. And the outcomes of this project, the report, which will soon be available. There's a toolkit, and one of the things that we were asked to do in creating this research project was to work on a toolkit for schools to use to analyze their work around parent engagement at the moment, and also to plan for the future. That already existed, but we were asked to refine it and make it available. So that is part of the report for Welsh Government, and bits of it have also been published in a journal article for the Wales Journal of Education, which is available open access both in English and in Welsh, and that is actually a hot link. I don't know if that's of any use, but I'm quite happy to send it to anyone who would like to know. And because we're all academics, if you go to the next slide, it's just got the sources that I used. So could we go back one? Because I think that makes far more sense. I don't know if you can go back. Yeah. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. You finished exactly on time, a minute before your scheduled ends. That's fantastic. Keeps us on track and on schedule. While we wait for the questions coming on the chat, hopefully, I've got a couple of questions about your presentation. So again, it was like the other two, fascinating and relevant, and a really relevant part of our research agenda in terms of asking important questions about Welsh system, post-pandemic recovery. So to what extent do you think your findings are typical compared to long-term and baseline levels of similar studies across either jurisdictions in the UK or other European countries? Are we seeing similar trends either before the pandemic within Wales and other countries, or after pandemic? So what are your thoughts on that?
I was surprised by the parents' finding. I expected the parents' findings to be more positive than they were. Because other things coming out in other areas, and indeed other work we've done within Wales, was more positive. Now, whether that was because of the demographic of parents that we were talking to, who are With that demographic of parents, they are often further estranged from schools, or the schools are further estranged from them, perhaps might be a better way of putting it. And there are definite deficit discourses operating. So that may be something, it is definitely something to follow up on.
We've got some questions coming in the chat here. Someone's asking, do you think there's a difference between responses from parents and members of staff in primary and secondary schools and rural and urban settings?
Definitely primary and secondary, yes. Secondary staff were more likely to, secondary staff are by nature and nature of the job more distanced from parents and families. Often families are not at the school gate. There are many more teachers for an individual child. So that was expected. We didn't do a cross section on urban and rural because we simply didn't really have enough data to do that with. So I couldn't answer that. But one of my recommendations always for secondary schools is to take a couple of teachers who are really, really interested in and ask them to spend a week in an early years centre and watch what parental engagement looks like in early years, because it's a very different beast.
Yeah, another question here in the chat. Was there any indication of why parents and staff had such different perspectives on the way in which parents engage with their children's learning? And how do you think leaders in schools can better align the expectations and understanding of each group?
To take the second bit first, the best way for leaders to understand what parents need and what staff need is to actually talk to them and actually ask them. And I know that sounds simplistic, and it sounds like something that a researcher far distant from the reality of schools might actually say. But in a previous bit of work for Welsh Government, there's a case study of a school that turned its parental engagement or its parent engagement around. It took about 3 years, and it took a new head teacher, and it took a lot of work on the part of both the head teacher and the SLT or the SMT and the parents. But there is a case study of a school that's actually done that in a very deprived area of South Wales. So a number of things. One, talk to your parents, talk to your staff, find out what they want, find out what they need. Talk to other local members of the school's community, find out what works for them. One of the things that I found in a very long time of doing this kind of research is that schools can be doing really good work, but they never share it because they assume if they're doing good work, everybody's doing that good work. And the reality may not be that everybody knows that bit of really good work. So sharing good practice and Welsh Government enabling schools to share that good practice. And think about centering things on learning rather than centering things on school. So the important things, schools exist to support learning. So it's about conversations around learning rather than conversations around anything else.
Another question in the chat. Why do you think teachers thought there were more barriers?
I'm reluctant to say on such a small sample, but I think there are a number of issues going on the wider literature, not going on to this sample, but going off the wider literature. We know that there is often a gulf between teachers who tend to be white middle class and by definition educated and parents who often aren't. So there's often a misunderstanding about what parent engagement actually looks like. Teachers may expect it to look like what they did or what they do, and parent engagement in a different group of parents may be very different, just as valuable, but it may be very different. So there could be a lack of understanding of what's actually going on, a lack of conversation going on. Can you repeat the question? I've managed to talk myself into confusion.
No, it was just, why do you think teachers perceive there are more barriers to parental engagement than the parents perceived?
I think also there's teachers are looking at parent involvement with the school. So they're thinking about barriers that keep parents from coming into the school rather than, at least with the sample we were looking at, thinking about barriers to engaging with learning. So they were thinking about things like why parents don't come into parents' evening, how parents don't come into other things in school, the fact that the idea of having family workshops came up with school staff. And I'm not saying those are a bad idea. They can work really, really well, but they need to be things that parents want, and they need to be centered in a way that means that the only people who come in aren't just the worried well, but that you get a wide range of parents.
Okay, another question in the chat here. We're working hard today, aren't we? Do you feel there will be additional benefits to better engagement of parents in their children's learning, other than necessarily improved learning outcomes and academic outcomes? For example, could it positively impact attendance?
Yes, quite simply, yes. There's a very good literature review by, I'm sorry, I cannot neither remember nor pronounce the academic's first name, but the surname is Bonk, B-O-O-N-K, and it came out in 2018, and it's a really thorough literature review about the impacts of parent engagement in children's learning, and attendance is definitely one of those things that can be improved. Homework return, social self-efficacy, mastery orientations, a whole range of things. Which is not necessarily a guarantee.
No.
But it helps. And forgive my cat shouting at me.
And then I've got a question here. You mentioned the asset-based approach for the sort of non-experts in the crowd here. Just a quick recap on what that phrase means.
To give an example, I was working with a group of schools in Scotland, and they talked about getting translators in for the parents. And I suggested what they were doing was getting translators in for the teachers rather than the parents, because the parents already spoke Arabic or Urdu or whatever and were getting on in English, whereas the teachers tended to be monolingual. It's about starting from where parents are and valuing what parents already bring, which means you have to know where parents are and what parents bring, not assume what parents are and what parents bring. So it's about looking and saying, wow, this is really good. It's the old phrase that we used to use in schools all the time, good now, even better if, rather than, oh, this really isn't very good at all, is it? And the thing is, teachers are really good at this because they do it every single day in the classroom. You know, teachers every single day in the classroom will look at a child who's struggling and say, wow, that's really, you know, you've done this bit really well. Now let's work on the rest. So the skills are already there.
And I think my experience in North Wales here, running a few of our close to practice projects, and one of them we had a PhD student running a trial with some schools on the use of evidence-informed practice and testing strategies for secondary school pupils. And she ran a really large-scale, well-designed, generalizable survey across our 54 secondary schools. And one of the findings was that overwhelmingly, they all wanted to know more about strategy you could use at home with their parents. So it was telling us quite clearly that these people just want to know how to use these things at home. They're even keen that their parents knew about them as well. So I think what you're saying for your research and the wider research is, you know, coming through in the work we've done in sort of a local level in North Wales. So it's fascinating. And I think you're right. It's maybe it needs to be more focused on academic and learner attainment and progress, and not necessarily on those sort of important, but that generally tends to be just pastoral, home links, communication channels. Has to be a bit more focused on the sort of the effective learning processes and communications and ideas with the parents, if possible.
And I think it's important that you said effective learning processes. Rather, it's not about content. It's about parents saying, wow, you're struggling with that. I'm really proud of you for struggling with that. It's also about parents saying, no, I don't know either. Where do you think we could find out? And again, every teacher has a bank of phrases that if a child comes to you and says, I can't do this, well, you've got a bank of phrases, well, you can't do it yet, or where do you think you can find out? We need to share those with parents. We need to let parents know that not being able to answer a question doesn't mean that you're failing your child. It means you're showing your child that you're still learning.
This is really fascinating. You know, I mean, to my ignorance, I didn't know there was such a. I mean, I should have known such a wealth of, you know, detailed and long-standing research in the theme of parents. So to my shame, I should have known that, I guess. But it's fascinating. So one final question for me before the clock's ticking at 17:35. I saw on one of your slides, forget the exact wording, was parents' perceptions or the negative perceptions of their experiences in schools. I didn't quite know what you made of that in terms of, we often as school leaders and teachers say, oh, well, the parents have had bad experiences here or in the school down the road, so that's why they're like they are, you know. So what are your thoughts on that as a final question?
It was interesting that it didn't come up in ours, but in the wider research, it's a very clear reason that parents often don't engage either with the school or with learning. And the phrase I tend to use is that teachers are trying to rebuild bridges that other people have broken. And if a school has been a site of failure for you, why would you engage with that? Why would you want to do that? That doesn't mean that you don't value education. And the problem is that often the two are elided, if that's a word. Is, people assume it's easy for school staff to assume, well, this person never comes in, they don't care about education. Well, it may be that actually walking onto the school site gives them a panic attack and they can't come in, but they're still really interested in their child's education and their child's learning. So it's about understanding that the two may not be the same.
Thanks, Janet. I'll let you go now, but not after a reminder of that lovely phrase you used, and nothing for us without us. I think it was something like that. Was a lovely little quote.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
It's the strapline of Parents International, but it's really, really important because often schools will say to me, well, we put all this stuff on for parents and they didn't come. I said, well, did you ask them if that's what they want? And again, we wouldn't do it. Well, we probably wouldn't do it for young people. We would ask, would you want this? We're getting much better at that. Universities are still really bad at that. We still put stuff on for staff without asking them if they really want it. But, as usual, schools are in the vanguard of this sort of thing, and universities trot along 20 years behind. I didn't say that. It wasn't me.
We're not recording, I don't think, but people could hear anyway. But that's fascinating. Thanks very much. That was a really, really interesting session. So I can see Sonia's back in the room with Fliss and Steve. So I think it's our group discussion time is just kicked over now. So I'm going to see if Steve can hear us, whether his connection's stabilised, and whether we can go back to Steve and we can do the Q&A we missed from his previous session. So are you there, Steve? Can you hear us?
I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, I think it was temporary. I've been able to follow.
Good.
There's nothing.
Oh, good.
So yeah, I'm all ears.
I'm glad you're with us. And I'm glad Janet's cat jumped off that table behind her and has gone to get his food, I think. Steve, we had a question in the chat. I'm going to scroll back up where we had a question coming in. Yeah, could you maybe explain a bit more about the e-learning program project you mentioned in one of your slides?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when you first mention e-learning, it doesn't sound the most exciting and innovative idea. But let's just put this in a wider context. I'm a clinical psychologist by background, so I'm retired from the NHS, and I normally work with people once they've had a breakdown, once on the knees. Everybody knows we need to do early intervention and preventative work, and part of that is informing people, giving people a new vocabulary, a new way of making sense of their experience. So I think e-learning has expanded so much now that the good quality programs are much more interactive. So the idea is that we have a way of explaining the core processes that enable people to reflect on their own experience. It's not good enough to be told about a psychological theory. You need to have reflected on how does arousal occur in me, and what does that look like? Likewise, a key part now of all mental health is it's not simply about eradicating symptoms. It's about enabling people to invest in the things that nourish them. There's a big investment by the government to promote the 5 ways to well-being. Another list of things that we're not doing. But ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to build on existing habits that you already have that nurture you. And to be careful and to notice when we fall into these traps. There's that lovely idea of the exhaustion funnel for people who are working too hard. So what do? They work even harder, and then they stop engaging in those things that are necessary for just maintaining an equilibrium. And then they start to experience they're not sleeping as well. They have a greater physical discomforts. They'll notice they'll become a little bit more hypervigilant, a bit more negative in the thinking. It's perfectly normal. A good way of thinking about it is, if we were asked to trek in the mountains every day for a year, you'd expect to have injuries. Yet when we're in very stressful environments, we're surprised when we start to struggle. So the e-learning that we want to develop has got to be accessible to school staff and to parents. And there will be some sort of variation. And I think the biggest challenge for us is getting people to sit down and to start it. The great thing I think that we have now is software that you can access on your phone. But if you're not going to use that, then how are we going to help people have a better understanding of their mental health? And this, when I was talking to a head teacher about this, he says he's bombarded daily with with suggestions for things for him to buy to promote mental health. And I think at least we're trying to root it in some coherent theory that's got some evidence base, that's accessible. The bottom line for me is they'll do it if they get some benefits. And it benefits for themselves, and hopefully it actually benefits for the people around them. So we're in the we've got a prototype. I think what we need people to give us feedback on examples, on the amount of time per chapter, the amount of topics covered. But surely it's not beyond the wit of man for us to come up with something that's actually embedded in the culture in which people work. When I start to have these conversations with teachers and I talk about things, have you ever walked down the corridor and you go into that class and your heart rate's increasing? You're driving into the car park and all of a sudden your stomach's churning. The world has become charged for you in a way, and before long you can think, oh man, I'm not coping, and then those old thoughts come back. Oh, my confidence is going. We could explain this a bit. So that's what when I say a prototype, it really does need to be interrogated and refined. But if we're not going to do that, then there's got to be some form of psychoeducation.
Well, I know your study took place, I think, just at the tail end of the pandemic or over the pandemic. So just in a wider sense, looking back at this, think about the slides you shared earlier on, those levels of mental health and well-being and that psychological flexibility, how do they compare to sort of general background levels of population level equivalence over time? In other words, how were we in Wales when you did that study?
Well, it's a tough one, that, because the people, when you send out a survey, it's interesting who decides to respond. The suggested figures of people who will at some point struggle with their mental health are pretty frightening. It's 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of us. I was actually quite impressed with we saw sort of decreased well-being scores, perhaps. I've got some figures that you can relate to the general population who are tickety-boo. The mental health scores on the core 10 were in the mild level. So generally, I thought that cohort was relatively healthy. But I think if we drill down, because we're dealing with means, you'll find a smaller group of people who are really struggling. So I don't know if it's that helpful to just simply say, how are we against a wider group? I think the real question is are you living the life you want to live? Are you flourishing? These are I think positive psychology is bringing a more optimistic and constructive way of starting to think about mental health. So I don't know. I don't think I'm really in a position to say whether my little bit of data can say that much on the well-being of Wales.
And then in terms of the population you sampled, do you have any plans for any follow-up work with those?
Yeah, I mean, we promised anybody who's going to work with us that we were going to try and develop this with you. We've started to work with some parent groups. I think that's really taken off. We moved in. There's an appetite for that from parent groups. My original idea of locating these parent groups within a school population, it's kind of hit a bit of a wall, because some of the feedback we got is actually they liked being anonymous and working with families from other geographical areas, and we were collaborating with the local parent support group. who's an independent charity, and they recruited a group for us. But I think the offer is there. We've just got some practical problems. The school that we've been working with is going through a particularly difficult time, but they're committed to working with us to develop this e-learning.
Thanks, Steve. So we've got 15 minutes left. I thought I'd bring in Sonia and Fliss and Janet to a general discussion about where this work sits in terms of the wider research on the impact of the pandemic. We know from recently published research. I don't know whether you saw, there's a really fascinating paper published in Nature Human Behaviour by a team based, an Anglo-French-Swedish team headed up by Betterhauser et al. So it's published, I think, in January, February time. So it's a systematic review of 42 studies across 15 countries on the impact of the pandemic on student learning and outcomes. So the overall findings were, so it's a really strongly designed study, an important study in a, as you know, a high-level journal, Nature Human Behaviour. So the findings were that pupils in the pandemic lost on average 35% of a normal school's year worth of learning, and that hasn't been recovered, but it hasn't widened over time. So the point was, what are policymakers doing? What can schools do? So I'm wondering, in the context of your work, Janet, and then your work, Steve, in terms of would you expect to see similar deficits, and would they be able to be closed more quickly than academic deficits, particularly Steve's work, and possibly will they be compounded further, Fliss and Sonia, with the learners you work that have had particularly traumatic and troubled backgrounds from these war-torn areas? So just a quick thought in the context of that interesting recent research from the in Nature Human Behaviour. Janet.
I'm going to problematize the whole thing, because the deficit that's being looked at is arbitrary in the first place. Why do we think all 7-year-olds should be at a specific point? I am far more concerned in what young people have actually learned and experienced than their measurement against an arbitrary standard. And I'm in print saying this because it makes me very, very angry. And because it undermines a lot of things. It undermines the work that families did during the lockdown. It undermines the work that teachers did under the lockdown. The whole discourse of schools being closed is ridiculous. Teachers were working harder in many areas than they'd ever worked before. So the schools weren't closed even if the physical building had shutters in it. Is it really necessary that they make up that amount? Is it... It worries me that we have these very arbitrary standards, and then we are saying to children, you are not good enough. And we're saying to young people, you're not good enough. That is not what anybody needs to hear. I defer to the psychologists among us, but I don't think that's what anybody needs to hear when they're coming out of something like this. So I kind of dispute the whole issue around it. I mean, what is that 35% going to mean in the workplace? What's it going to mean in 10 years? I know there is research out there that shows how much in salary costs young people who went through the pandemic will lose over the course of their lifetime. But I don't understand how that's calculated, because as far as I was concerned, everybody went through the lockdown and everybody. So, yeah. I will stop ranting, but it is a rant.
No, fascinating point, Janet, and a relevant point as well. Sonia, you've got a thought on that?
Yeah, I think that if we look at the sort of refugee group, I think we need to really look at them as individuals. They've got these very unique needs. I mean, they've already experienced war, violence, lots and lots of upheaval and displacement. They've moved to lots of different countries. They've had all these issues. I think the COVID pandemic was not exactly irrelevant to them, but it was kind of, fairly low down that list of traumas that they've already experienced. And they're now having to learn Welsh and English and try to understand the UK education system. And I think they need specialised support. We need to understand what kinds of support would suit them best, what kinds of timetables would suit them best, and try to work towards getting them some, reasonable qualifications so that they can partake economically in this new society where they've arrived, and so that they can feel a sense of belonging. And I agree to some extent with what Janet was just saying, that the pandemic was just one of a whole list of things that have happened to them, and will, that in terms of their adaptation and integration, it's just the next bit really that's important.
Thanks. Fliss, you've got a thought on that?
Yeah, lots of thoughts on that. It's a finding out, as Sonia was saying, about what refugee families feel that they need, is hopefully the next part of where we'll go with this project, is that we will expand this to make sure that we include the voices of families and of the students as well. One of the things that came out of the study is this, the complications of the stress that learners have gone through make it difficult for them to learn. And so as the English starts to develop, we're becoming more and more aware of actually the different types of trauma that a child or young person may or may not have experienced. And this, going back to what Richard was saying, asking originally about, is this best practice that we're seeing in school, or this good practice that's being seen in school, is it based on evidence? Well, that's something that we didn't hear much of. People weren't saying, oh, we've tried this, or we've tried this approach and this approach at all, because I think this, the schools in the south of Wales have a higher population of learners with EAL than we have up in the north of Wales, in the schools that we were looking at. And so we were looking at schools where they actually have reasonably good, obviously you can always do better, but EAL provision is in place. And so what the schools are doing, rather than going sort of back to the drawing board and looking at new evidence that might show different ways of teaching these children, getting things right for them, so using the sort of tried and tested methods that they've been using in schools. Now, those may not be based on evidence, but it's what the schools are finding are working for them and their population at the moment, which in a time of crisis, which the pandemic was for schools, was probably about the best that you can hope for. But I think moving forward, it would be really useful to look at different research, look at different evidence-based practices that could be fed back into schools in terms of developing policies and developing practice that might be helpful. What we don't want is to, schools to think they can just like buy into, we're going to buy into something and it's going to make it all better, because that buy-in might not be the right thing for their school, or for their staff, or for their cohort of changing children. So I think there's a lot to unpack and a lot to move forward with, but I feel like we've made a little bit of a start in the work that we've done, but we're both really passionate, and as they are in Cardiff Met, and I'm sure with other collaborations as well, in developing this further to make things, to look at some improvements really. But wherever we go with it, in everything that we've said, there's always going to be a need for training, there's going to be a need for information, there's going to be a need for money to put into these things. What we did know is that all the teachers that we spoke to were passionate about this. They're absolutely trying to do the right thing for their learners. They're beside themselves with, I mean, really was, we had these very long interviews, and it was quite cathartic, I think, for some, teachers to be able to tell their story over what's happened over that period of time, which was really very stressful for everybody. And within that, them trying to do the very best for those children. So, I feel that there's the goodwill and the passion is out there to support this group of learners. It's just getting it right and having the resources to do it.
Thanks, Fliss. We've got 3 minutes left, so we'll go to Sonia and then finally Steve. So Sonia first.
Sorry, I didn't mean to have my hand still up. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, never mind. Steve.
Two quick points. I mean, I agree totally with what Janet was saying, and there's always a danger when I'm describing the children and young people who I work with, who are often disadvantaged and have a list of people go through the challenges and the difficulties that they have, then this is just another problem and difficulty that is added to that. And yet, I think one of the things that we did find is that this has been a time where people have overcome challenges and have bonded. There's clearly a small group who, because of the changes, end up with some unhelpful behavior patterns or withdrawal, and that impairs their interaction with the world around them. But the whole period of lockdown has been a challenge. And I remember the head teacher saying proudly, our school never closed. And that the way, and even though we're listing some of the difficulties that the staff faced with new staff and the whole challenge that they had personally of lockdown, they were problem solving and collaborating and working together. And so there is this process of adaptation and learning that goes on. So I think as we come out of this, it is an opportunity to reflect. And I hope some of the narrative that I was trying to get across, understanding some of the processes that go on that were difficult, but what did we do that worked? That we do know we need networks, that we do know we need to invest in gold. I mean, we do know to have to look after ourselves a little bit, and it does make the difference. And so it has been an opportunity for learning. We'll see whether we take that forward.
Thanks, Steve. So there are clearly implications from all of your comments that how we value and measure and gauge progress in schools, and also how we measure that sort of ultimate value of a school in the system in terms of the aspects that you'd be working on. So I'm going to draw things to a close. It's 5:56. So in this seminar, we've heard from 3 of the projects that form part of Welsh Government's Collaborative Evidence Network. I'd like to thank Steve, Janet, Sonia and Fliss today for their insightful presentations. First, we heard from Steve, who presented his findings of an investigation into the impact of the pandemic on children's, teachers and parents' health and wellbeing in A-Lane context. And then second, we heard from Sonia and Fliss, who explained their work investigating the impact of the pandemic on refugee families and children in Wales. And finally, Janet explained her work looking into parents and the pandemic and transition. So the strengths of these SEN projects lay in the collaborative nature of both identification of research priorities aligned with national policy priorities, together with the sharing of expertise and skills between universities in Wales to enable the findings to be disseminated to Welsh Government and to the wider education system. For example, in this seminar today, which I hope you've thoroughly enjoyed. The findings in these reports will also enable Tier 1 and Tier 2 organisations, Welsh Government, local authorities and regional consortia, to hopefully make better informed decisions about key aspects of education policy, both in its inception but also critically in its delivery and implementation in schools. And the combination of evidence-informed approaches at these key stages can only improve the quality of policy delivery and is, of course, a key tenet of the national strategy that I mentioned during my introduction. So I'd like to thank Steve, Sonia, Fliss and Janet again for the presentations and their responses and contributions during the discussions. We really appreciate their time here today with us. I'd also like to thank the members of their respective teams who can't be with us today, but were a vital part of the evidence gathering, evaluation and report writing process. And I know how much hard work that is to be part of a team. So thank you all again for your hard work, and especially if you're in the crowd watching this afternoon on video. Thanks to you all. And finally, I'd like to, I think you'll agree that the findings presented today highlight the benefit of working collaboratively within the framework of the National Strategy for Education, Research and Inquiry, NSER. And this has allowed us to start aligning key resources and expertise within the Welsh university system with teachers and school leaders for the benefit of policymakers, regional consortia, local authorities and schools. I believe it's also a model of what can be achieved in organisations and understand how their expertise and knowledge could be shared as we strive towards a more evidence-informed and effective education system in Wales. So diolch yn fawr iawn a'ch amser pnawn 'ma. Thank you very much for finding the time to join us this afternoon, and I hope you found the presentations and information interesting and useful. I'd like to wish you a very pleasant evening.